What if I told you that there is a game that helps you speak Chinese more fluently, is great for improving communicative ability, and works well almost regardless of your current level? What if I said that the game is also free and fun to play? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this episode, which will be the last for 2021, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite games for learning and teaching Chinese. And indeed, this works not just for Chinese, but for any language. But since this is the Hacking Chinese podcast, I will of course use Chinese examples. I've been interested in games much longer than I've been learning and teaching Chinese, but it's only recently that I've been able to combine these two passions in a productive way. For example, I've written several articles about this, and I will put some of the links to those in the description. And nowadays I also teach a professional development course at my university, which is targeted at language teachers throughout the Swedish school system and attempts to show how games can be used to increase engagement and motivation in the classroom. And when I'm talking about games here, I'm mostly talking about analog games, so board games, card games, word games, that kind of thing. I also think there is huge potential for video games and computer games for language learning too, but those are not as accessible, and I think that analog games have a potential to reach many more students and benefit you in more ways than digital games can. So I currently have two favorite games for teaching Chinese, and one of them is Codenames. And I've written an article called Playing Codenames to Learn Chinese. That's not what I'm going to talk about today though, because that game is slightly harder to introduce, and while I think it has great potential for learning and teaching languages, it is not really what I want to get at today, because I'm mostly after fluency, being able to use the Chinese that you've already studied to communicate effectively. And when it comes to this, there is no game that beats word-guessing games such as Alias or Taboo. And you don't need to be familiar with those commercial titles. I'm not interested in a specific game in this episode, but I am interested in the core mechanic of games where you describe a word without using that word, and then the other people are supposed to guess what word you are describing. And if that doesn't sound very fancy, that's okay. And if you don't see the great potential yet, that's okay too. But believe me, I've studied many games and their potential use for language learning, and this is my top pick. So the goal in this week's episode is to explain how the game works, why it's so good for language learners, and also, finally, how to adjust the game to better suit your situation. So let's go through the rules real quick. And when it comes to games in general, like I said, I'm not interested in a specific commercial product here. I'm after the core mechanic, which is very simple. If you buy a game that's built on this mechanic, they might have lots of other rules, lots of scoring, lots of fancy things that I don't really care about here. I'm just after the core concept that you can use with your friends without buying anything and without doing any kind of preparations, really. So this is how it works. First, you find or create a list of Chinese words, and it's important that both you and your partner know the words. At least there should be a good chance of that. Perhaps you can choose a chapter you've studied in a textbook, or a word list below your level, or something like that. If you want to be lazy about it, or just don't have enough time to go around looking for word lists, you can of course just come up with words on the fly. Just think of words that you think that the other person knows, and use that instead. Second, you select a word or think of a word, and you start describing it to your friend in Chinese without using the word you're describing. So if it's 汽车, car, you are not allowed to say that, of course, because your goal is to convey the meaning of that word so that your partner says it without using the word itself. In the basic version of the game, you are not allowed to use parts of the word either. So if we keep going with the 汽车 example, you are not allowed to use 汽 either. So you cannot say it's like, oh, it's the first character in 汽水, soda, and then say the second character in 火车. That doesn't work because you're not allowed to refer to 汽 and 车 separately either. Third, you keep describing the word until your partner has guessed the right word. And they are allowed to ask questions for clarification maybe, or they want more information, or they want to ask questions about the object you're describing or something like that. That's fine. Here you can deploy several different strategies. You can, for example, describe what the word means, like a kind of definition of the word. You can describe what it's used for, where it's found, what it looks like, and so on and so forth. Anything that allows your partner to guess. Fourth, when your partner has guessed the correct word, you switch roles and it's now their turn to describe a new word that you don't know, and it's your mission to guess the right word. Then you reverse the roles again and you can keep going for as long as you want, maybe with some of the variations I will go through soon. So let's play this game a little bit together, and of course you cannot talk to me, but I can talk to you. So I will describe 3 words to you in Chinese. I will keep it as simple as possible. If you started learning Chinese last week, maybe this will be a little bit hard, but I've tried to keep it as simple as possible. Number 1. 这是一个房间，里面有老师，也有学生，里面有黑板，也有书。Number 2. 这是一个东西，每家都有，可以用来放东西、吃饭、工作。它有4个腿，不是椅子。Number 3. 这个东西很高，是绿的。它喜欢太阳。森林里有很多。So if this was roughly at the right level for you, you might want to pause and listen again if you didn't get anything, or if this is way below your level, you get the point of what I'm trying to get at here. And if you try to guess the right words, you should have said 汽车 for number 1. That was kind of obvious because I used it as an example earlier. And then it was 桌子 for number 2, table. And then for the third one, it's 树, tree. Now that we all know how the game works, let's explore why this is so good. The most important thing is that the game is fun to play almost regardless of level. So if you're a beginner, this game is fun to play. I played it as a beginner when I started learning Chinese, and I've played it as a native speaker of Swedish, and it's basically fun at all levels. And most people I've played this game with also think it's fun, so it has a very broad appeal. It's also good because it gets you speaking, and we all know as beginners and even intermediate learners that it's hard to talk because you have a limited amount of words you know, and you have to look things up and you feel I don't know how to say this, and then you got to look something up and so on and so forth. But in this game you just go for it. You have to use what you know to describe something and get meaning across. I've used this game with many students who are shy and not really willing to talk, and this is not just in Chinese, and it works pretty well. The game is also great because it helps you navigate conversations. And if you think about it, talking fluently in a language is much about being able to predict where a sentence is going and choosing a path through it that you can actually handle. So it's not so much about knowing all the words as it is about being really good at using what you already know to say something. If you think about it, not being able to say something is almost the same thing as not being allowed to say it in this game. So what you're doing when you're playing the game is that you're practicing over and over to navigate around obstacles in conversations that you can't deal with. And this skill is great to have and will enable you to sound much more fluent than you would have sounded if you hadn't played this game. I also like this game because it puts the emphasis squarely on communication, like I said. And it's not there to practice a specific grammar pattern, to drill some words or something like that. You just use the language as a tool to communicate something. The game is also very flexible when it comes to number of players, because you can play with just a friend, that works fine, but you can also play in a larger group or with several teams. And as a teacher, for example, this is very good to have an activity that is so flexible when it comes to number of students per group. The game is also ridiculously easy to get started. You can explain it to someone in 5 minutes, like I did earlier, and then you can just start immediately. It takes no time, and if you have words prepared in advance, or if you just choose words yourself, there is literally no prep time. Finally, even though I don't think this should be the main focus, this type of game also allows you to recycle vocabulary. So maybe use it with something you learned last week or last month, and this is a fun way to revisit the vocabulary you studied back then. So to summarize, it is a fun game that allows you to target fluency specifically, and along the way it also has several other advantages. But of course, exactly how you use the game will depend on your level. And this is where I want to stress that I'm not talking about a particular commercial game here. I'm talking about this general concept of guessing words by having someone describe them without using the word itself. Because there are many ways you can vary the game, many parameters you can fiddle with to create the perfect game for you. And some of these will make the game much easier, some of them will make it much harder, and some of them will just make it different. And we're all different, we like different types of games, and by experimenting, you will be able to find a game that is as suitable as possible for you. The first thing you can do is to think about what types of words are used. So if you think about it, the words that I chose for the demonstration earlier in this episode, they were all concrete nouns, so car, table, and tree. But if I would have used a conjunction or maybe some grammar word or an abstract noun, that would have been much harder to guess. So if you think the game is too hard, try removing these abstract or grammar related words and just stick to concrete nouns. Everyday objects is a good place to start. In a similar vein, you can also limit the amount of vocabulary the person can guess from by, say, having a fixed list. So let's say you're both looking at the same word list, maybe in a textbook, and you know that your partner is describing one of these words. It then gets a lot easier because you don't have thousands and thousands of words to guess from, just these 30 in the textbook. And that, of course, makes it much easier. Next, you can also vary the types of clues that you allow, and in the basic game, as I've described it, you're just relying on verbal cues. But if this is too hard, there is nothing that stops you from using body language or even drawings to support your learning. Now, of course, if you're only drawing, it turns into Pictionary, and that you can say is not very related to learning Chinese, of course. So you need to use these supports with some kind of limitation. But I'm just saying this because there are various ways you can make the game easier in this way. Another thing you can do is to vary how much you allow people to choose or skip words. Because of course, if you can choose the words yourself, you can choose the easiest ones. But if you have a fixed list that you have to go through in order, for example, then it's much less forgiving. So if this is your first time playing the game, or if your Chinese is not that good yet, I suggest that you allow players to choose words and to skip words if they turn out to be very difficult. Conversely, if you want to make the game harder, introduce more competition, which we will talk about in a bit, you should of course not allow people to skip words, or if you do it, they should get penalized, maybe deduce points or something like that. If you want to make it more competitive, the first thing you should probably do is to introduce some kind of time limit. And this varies greatly with your skill and your ability both to play the game and in the language in question. So for example, when playing this with native speakers, it's not unusual to see good players being able to explain and describe 10 words successfully in 1 minute. So that's 1 word every 6 seconds. But beginners will typically struggle to do even a single word in, say, 2 or 3 minutes. And then, of course, it doesn't make sense to have a time limit at all. But if you want to make it competitive, keep lowering the time. Maybe start with 2 minutes and lower it from there. And of course, a crucial element for making this more competitive is to introduce teams or to compete against each other using some kind of scoring system. And of course, if you're 2 players, there is no meaningful way of scoring because this is a game of communication. You need to be able to explain something, but the other person also needs to guess. So 2 players, you can't really do that competitively. But from 3 players and upwards, you can. So if you are 3 players, you just award points to the person who correctly guesses the word, and that person then chooses the next word and keeps going. So the person who guesses gets 1 point, and whoever gets the most points wins. If you're also playing with a time limit, you can also award points to the person doing the descriptions, because then of course the more you can do within the allotted time, the better, and the players who guess correctly also get points. If you are 4 players or more, you can split into teams and see how many words each team can communicate within the allotted time, and so on. These are not all the parameters you can play with, but I'm sure that this will give you enough variation to find a specific combination of these that suits your learning situation. I think that's more than enough to show how this type of game works, and I also think I've explained why it is so good for building fluency in Chinese. If you have tried this game out, or if you have any other questions, feel free to head over to the article on Hacking Chinese, leave a comment, or chat me up on social media, or get in touch in some other way. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.